there's a specific question you probably haven't asked yourself. If the power went out tomorrow and stayed out for 6 weeks in January, how long would you last in your own apartment? Most people picture it wrong. They picture discomfort. They picture putting on a sweater and watching the breath fog up in the kitchen. Maybe boiling water on a camping stove. They don't picture what it actually is, which is a slow argument between your body and the room that the room always wins, unless you know something specific about heat that almost nobody learns anymore. Rita Okonkwo knew it. She went by Rita. 58 years old when this story starts. Spokane, Washington. The winter of 2011, which people in that part of the state still bring up because of how early the cold came in and how long it sat. Rita was not a survival expert. She hadn't taken a class. She'd been a home health aide for 22 years before a slip disc took her out of that work, and then a divorce took her out of a duplex on Mission Avenue, and then 4 months of couch surfing with a cousin took her out of the last place she had to sleep indoors. By November, she was living in a 1996 Ford Aerostar minivan parked behind a Baptist church off Freya Street. The van didn't run. The heater didn't work. The back 2 rows of seats had been removed by whoever owned it before her, and she'd bought it from him for $240 cash. This is where most stories about homelessness want to get sad. That's not what this story is. Because Rita did something over the next 4 winters that almost nobody does anymore. She figured out, from scratch, how to stay warm without heating. Not comfortable. Warm enough. Alive warm. Sleep through the night warm. In a metal box. In a city where January nights sit around 20 degrees and sometimes drop to single digits. And the things she learned are the things that your great-grandmother knew, and her mother, and the women before that, going back as far as anyone ever lived without a furnace. Which is most of human history. We forgot it in about 2 generations. Rita didn't forget it. She rebuilt it. Alone. In a van. With a spiral notebook and a library card and a lot of time. What follows is what she knew. The first thing she told a woman named Cheryl, who ran the drop-in center on 2nd Avenue, was that cold isn't one thing. Cheryl remembered this. She wrote it down later because of how Rita said it, like she was correcting a small but important mistake. Cold, in a building with heat, is an absence. You notice it the way you notice a light bulb going out. Something stops working. Cold in a van in January is a presence. It comes at you from 4 directions, and it has 4 different personalities, and if you don't know which one is doing what to you, you can't fight any of them. The floor took her heat. That was one. The walls took her heat a different way. Slower, meaner. A steady drain that she didn't notice until her hands stopped working well enough to open a can. The air inside the van got colder than the air outside, once her breath had been in it for 4 or 5 hours, because moisture was doing something to the physics that she didn't fully understand yet. And the wind, when it came across the parking lot and hit the side of the van, did something that felt like the van itself was getting colder, even though nothing had actually changed about the temperature. 4 cold, 4 different fights. She wrote that in the notebook. Nobody taught her this. She figured it out because she had to. And because she was 58 and had been a home health aide and had watched old people in unheated rooms for 22 years and had a working memory of what happened to them. In what order, when the heat went out. The first night in the van, she slept in 2 sweatshirts, a winter coat, and a knit hat. She woke up at 3 in the morning shaking so hard her teeth were clicking. The problem, she figured out later, was the floor. All her heat had gone down through the coat, through the 2 sweatshirts, through the thin foam of the back seat she was using as a mattress, through the carpet, through the metal of the floor, into the frozen asphalt of the parking lot, which had, more or less, the same temperature as Siberia. She was, effectively, lying on Siberia, wearing a coat. A woman named Dolores, who ran a food bank about 6 blocks from where Rita parked, is the one who told me this next part. Dolores had been watching Rita for about 3 weeks before Rita said more than thank you. One afternoon in early December, Rita came in to pick up the bag of canned goods Dolores had put aside for her, and she stood there with her hand on the edge of the table and asked a question that Dolores said she still thinks about. She asked if Dolores knew where she could get a piece of cardboard that was about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide and was still flat, meaning it hadn't been broken down or folded. Dolores said she could probably find one. Rita thanked her. Then Rita said something like, "The floor is trying to kill me at night, and I think a big piece of cardboard on the floor of the van will slow it down." Dolores asked what she meant by kill her. Rita said it wasn't fast. Cold through the floor doesn't kill you fast. But you don't sleep right, and when you don't sleep right for enough nights in a row, you start making bad decisions during the day. And the bad decisions are what kill homeless people in winter, not the cold itself. The decisions the cold makes you make. Dolores said she remembered standing there with the bag in her hands and feeling like she was being taught something. She found Rita the cardboard that same afternoon. The cardboard did help. Rita put it down on the metal floor of the van and then put the foam seat on top of the cardboard and her sleeping bag on top of the foam. She said the difference was not small. She said the first night she did it, she slept until 6 in the morning without waking up. That single piece of cardboard probably added about 12 degrees to her body by morning. Air pockets. Thousands of tiny air pockets inside the corrugation of the cardboard. Air doesn't conduct heat the way metal does. Trap enough air between yourself and whatever is trying to drink your warmth, and the drink becomes a sip. Rita didn't know the word conduction. She didn't care. She knew that a flat piece of brown box between her body and the cold ground was the difference between a night that ended at 3 and a night that ended at 6. The women who slept in unheated cabins on the American plains in 1890 knew the same thing. They used straw ticks, which are cotton sacks stuffed with dry straw. Straw is basically the same thing as cardboard from a thermal standpoint. Millions of tiny air pockets between the body and the floor. Cardboard, straw, pine boughs, newspaper. It's all the same trick. The trick is the air, not the material. Rita knew this in her hands before she knew it in words. There's a thing that happens to a body when it's been too cold for too many hours that you don't forget once you've felt it. It isn't pain. Pain would be easy. It's a kind of forgetting. Your fingers forget how to do small things. Your face forgets how to make expressions. Your thinking forgets how to finish sentences. Rita wrote about this in the spiral notebook, in blue ballpoint pen, in a handwriting that got worse as the pages went on because by the end she was writing in the van at night with cold fingers. The handwriting itself is a kind of data. She wrote that the first sign of being dangerously cold wasn't shivering. That was the second sign. The first sign was a feeling of being okay, a feeling of having solved the problem, a feeling of warmth that wasn't real warmth, but was her body giving up on trying to warm her anymore, and instead pulling the blood away from her skin, toward her core, where it was needed more. She wrote, "When you feel warm and you shouldn't, that's when it's actually bad." She wrote it twice on 2 different pages, months apart. The second winter she was in the van, 2012 into 2013, she made what she called the nest. Dolores, the food bank woman, called it the nest too, because that's what Rita called it, and the word stuck. The nest was a system. It had 6 layers, and each layer did a specific thing, and Rita had tested each layer over the previous winter by adding it and removing it and seeing what happened to how she felt at 4 in the morning. Bottom layer was the cardboard on the metal floor. That one she never changed. Second layer was the foam from the back seat, which she'd cut into a piece exactly the size of her body, plus a little extra on each side. She didn't want extra foam that wasn't under her. Foam that wasn't under her was just losing heat to the air. Third layer was an old wool army surplus blanket, folded in half lengthwise, so it was double thick underneath her. Wool was important to her. Cheryl, the drop-in center woman, said Rita had a whole philosophy about wool versus synthetic, and the philosophy was simple. Wool works when it's wet. Nothing else does. Wool doesn't insulate quite as well as down or polyester fill when they're dry. But Rita wasn't worried about dry. Rita was worried about what happens at 4 in the morning when you've been breathing inside a sleeping bag for 7 hours and everything is a little damp. At that point, she said, wool is the only thing that keeps working. Fourth layer was her actual sleeping bag, which she'd gotten for $8 at a thrift store and which was rated, according to the tag, to 40 degrees. 40 degrees was useless on its own. In the van in January, 40-degree rated bags are a joke. But Rita didn't use it on its own. Fifth layer was a second sleeping bag, unzipped and laid over the first one like a comforter. She'd been given this one by Cheryl's drop-in center. It was rated to 20. 2 bags layered together are not worth the sum of their ratings. They're worth more than that. The air trapped between them becomes its own insulation. Rita figured this out empirically, by trying it. She didn't know the math. The math would have agreed with her. 6th layer was what Dolores called the trick. Rita kept, next to where she slept, a 1-gallon plastic milk jug. Every night before she got into the nest, she'd fill the milk jug with the hottest water she could get from the bathroom sink at a 24-hour gas station about 4 blocks away. She'd wrap the hot milk jug in a t-shirt. She'd put the wrapped milk jug down by her feet, inside the nest, under all the layers. A hot water bottle, the oldest trick in the book. Women in farmhouses in Pennsylvania were doing it in 1840. Women on ships crossing the Atlantic were doing it in 1700. Someone probably did it in a Roman villa in February of the year 80. A gallon of hot tap water holds about 20,000 calories of heat energy. Your body, asleep, produces about 70 calories of heat per hour. The jug at her feet was giving her, for the first 4 or 5 hours of the night, roughly the same amount of heat that her whole body was producing, which doubled her output, which meant the nest didn't have to work as hard, which meant the nest got warmer, faster, and stayed warm longer. By 4 in the morning, the jug was lukewarm. By 6, it was cold. But by then, the sun was coming up and the air inside the van was starting to warm, and the worst of the night was over. She did this every night for 4 winters. Something I should say, before this goes any further. Rita did not think of herself as doing anything clever. She didn't think the nest was smart. She thought the nest was obvious. She thought anyone would have figured it out if they had to sleep in a van in January, because all she had done was pay attention to what was cold and what was warm, and move things around until the warm parts were bigger than the cold parts. This is worth saying, because the culture we live in, which heats its homes with a little plastic rectangle on the wall, has forgotten something about how intelligence and survival used to be tangled together. People who had to stay warm without a furnace were not simpler than us. They were smarter about one specific thing than almost anyone alive today. Rita relearned it in a parking lot, which is not impressive unless you try. Try, some January, to sleep in an unheated metal box for 8 hours and wake up not damaged. Most people cannot. Most people have never in their lives had to. The third thing Rita figured out, which surprised her more than the cardboard and the hot water bottle combined, was the problem with breathing. A person, sleeping normally, exhales about half a liter of water vapor every hour. In 8 hours, that's 4 liters. 4 liters of water puffed out in little warm damp clouds has to go somewhere. In a house with heat, it gets absorbed by the dry heated air and carried away by the furnace circulation, and you never think about it. You don't know it's happening. The system handles it. In a van, in January, with the windows shut, there is no system. The moisture comes out of your mouth, hits the cold metal of the roof, and condenses. Drops of water form. The drops run down the walls. The sleeping bag gets damp. Your clothes get damp. The damp clothes conduct heat away from your body 25 times faster than dry clothes. You are, without realizing it, turning your shelter into a rain chamber. And the rain chamber is yours. You made it. You can't stop making it. You're still breathing. Rita figured this out the hard way. The first winter, by January, her sleeping bag smelled like a basement. The inside of the van had mildew along the seams of the roof. She solved it 3 ways. First, she cracked the back window about half an inch, just enough to let air move. She lost some heat doing this. Not as much as you'd think, because the air in the van was going to get exchanged eventually anyway, through every imperfect seal in a 15-year-old Ford. Second, she slept with her head partly out of the sleeping bag. This sounds counterintuitive, colder head, right? But she didn't want her breath going into the bag. Her breath going into the bag meant her bag got wet and her bag stopped working. Third, she put a cotton sheet inside the sleeping bag next to her body and a wool blanket between the cotton sheet and the bag itself. The cotton wickeded moisture off her skin. The wool held it without losing insulating value. The bag stayed relatively dry. It was a 3-stage moisture management system. She didn't call it that. She called it the shirt trick, because the inner sheet was just an old bed sheet, folded in half and sewn up one side to make a tube. The shirt trick worked. Rita, in the notebook, wrote, "Wet is colder than cold." She underlined it. I want to tell you about the night she almost died. Cheryl told me this story the second time I met her. She hadn't told me the first time because, she said, she wasn't sure she wanted to tell me at all. It was the winter of 2013. Late January, the temperature had dropped to 7 degrees Fahrenheit with a wind chill well below zero. This was the cold snap that, if you lived in eastern Washington that year, you probably remember. Pipes burst all over Spokane. A man died in an alley off Division Street. 2 dogs froze to death in a yard. Rita had the nest set up. The hot water bottle was at her feet. The cardboard was under the foam. Everything was working the way it was supposed to work. What went wrong was the propane. Rita, by that winter, had added a small catalytic propane heater to her setup. She used it only for 15 minutes in the evening to warm the air in the van before she got into the nest. She ran it with the window cracked, the way the manual said. She knew about carbon monoxide. She was careful. But on this particular night, the wind shifted, and the small gap she'd left in the window wasn't where the air was moving, and the air wasn't moving. She fell asleep, with the heater still on. What woke her up was the hot water bottle. She'd rolled over onto it, and the heat against her hip was enough to drag her out of a sleep that was already going somewhere bad. She was nauseous, dizzy, confused. She later said her head felt like someone had put a bag of wet sand inside it. She figured out what was wrong. In about 10 seconds, she got the door open. She got out of the van. She sat on the frozen asphalt of the church parking lot in her sock feet and breathed cold air until her head started working again. The propane heater went in a dumpster the next morning. She never used another one. This is the part of the story where I want you to notice something. Rita survived that night because of the hot water bottle. Not because of the propane heater, because of a 1-gallon jug of tap water she'd heated up at a gas station bathroom 4 hours earlier and put by her feet. The oldest trick saved her from the newest tool. She wrote about this in the notebook too. She wrote, "The new ways fail, the old ways don't." It's not completely true. The old ways fail too sometimes, but you can see why she wrote it. There's a whole category of knowledge about cold that is specific to women, and that Rita talked about with Cheryl and Dolores, but never with anyone else, because the men in her life, she said, never seemed to want to hear about it. Women, on average, have a lower resting metabolic rate than men, about 10% lower, all else equal. This means that a woman in the same room as a man, wearing the same clothes, will feel colder, not because she's weaker, because she's producing less heat per hour. Women also have a slightly different pattern of blood flow, less to the hands and feet, more to the core, which keeps the core warm longer but makes the fingers go numb sooner. Rita knew this from having been a home health aide. She'd watched old women get cold faster than old men in the same house at the same thermostat setting. She'd seen it dozens of times. She believed it about herself, which is why her system was focused on 2 things that men's cold weather systems usually aren't. The feet. The feet, because women lose heat from the extremities faster. The hot water bottle at the feet wasn't just nice. It was structural. The belly, because women's core heat retention is better than men's, but only if the core is warm to start with. If you let a woman's belly get cold, it's very hard to get it warm again without outside help. So Rita slept with a second wool garment, a kind of wide wool scarf that she wrapped around her midsection under everything else. She called it the belt. The belt stayed on even when nothing else did. She told Cheryl once, "You can be a woman in the cold and you can be warm, but you have to know yourself different than a man would, or you'll do what the men do, and the men's way doesn't work as well for us." This is the kind of thing that isn't in any manual, because the people who wrote the manuals were almost all men, because the people who historically had to sleep outside in winter in modern industrial society have been overwhelmingly men, because the women who knew this stuff learned it in kitchens and farmhouses and never wrote it down. Rita wrote it down. Her spiral notebook, as of the 4th winter, had about 60 pages of notes. She kept the notebook hidden. That detail matters. Cheryl told me she kept it inside a Ziploc bag, inside a sock, inside a specific corner of a specific cardboard box that she always put in the same spot in the van. If anyone ever broke into the van, the notebook would probably be the last thing they'd find, and the only thing Rita would have wept over losing. Because the notebook was, Rita said, the only thing keeping her from having to figure all of this out again every winter. Memory, she said, doesn't work right in the cold. You learn something in November. By February, after enough bad nights, you start forgetting why you did it. You start questioning yourself. You start thinking, maybe I don't need the cardboard tonight. Maybe the cardboard isn't helping. Maybe I'm wrong about the cardboard. And one night you skip the cardboard. And you wake up at 3 a.m. shaking. The notebook was there so she couldn't talk herself out of what she'd already learned. Cheryl, who had worked with homeless people for 19 years, said she'd never seen anyone do this. She'd seen people get systems. She'd seen people get smart. She'd never seen anyone write it all down in order to protect their future self from their present self. Spring came. Rita went through 4 of them in the van. In the 4th spring, 2015, Cheryl and Dolores and a 3rd woman named Patrice, who worked at a county housing office, got Rita into a subsidized 1-bedroom apartment on Wall Street. The apartment had heat. Rita moved in April. This is where you expect the story to end. It doesn't end there. Because the first winter Rita lived in that apartment, the heat was included in the rent, and the heat worked, and Rita kept most of her system anyway. She kept the wool blanket, she kept the belt, she kept the habit of cracking a window at night to deal with moisture, and she kept the hot water bottle at her feet every single night, from November to March. Cheryl asked her about it. Rita said, "The apartment is warm because someone decided it should be warm, and someone can decide it shouldn't be, and then I'm in a cold room with no system." She said, "The system is mine. The heat is theirs." She said, "I don't want to forget what I know." The notebook is in a drawer in Cheryl's office now. Rita died in 2019 of a heart attack in the apartment on Wall Street. She was 66. Her daughter, who she had reconnected with in the last 2 years of her life, told Cheryl the notebook had been important to her mother and that she wanted it kept somewhere it could do good. Cheryl photocopied the pages. She gives copies to women who come into the drop-in center in October and November. The ones she can tell are going to be outside that winter. She doesn't give the copies to men. Rita's daughter was specific about that. The notebook was for women, because that's who Rita wrote it for. I asked Cheryl if I could read it. She said I could sit in her office and look at it, but not take it home, and not photograph the pages. So I sat in her office for about 3 hours on a Thursday afternoon in early October, and I read Rita Okonkwo's spiral notebook from cover to cover. Most of what I've told you so far came from that reading, but some of it didn't make it in. There are pages about how to dry socks on your own body at night, under the sleeping bag, so they're dry by morning without you getting up. There are pages about the specific kind of plastic grocery bag that works best as a vapor barrier inside a boot, and the specific ones that don't. There are pages about how to eat for warmth, which is not about eating a lot of food, but about eating specific foods at specific times, the last real meal being a small one heavy on fat about 2 hours before sleep. There are pages about light, how a candle in a coffee can, set on a stone with the lid perforated, puts out more usable warmth than almost anyone believes, and is safer than it sounds if you know the geometry. Women in old farmhouses knew this. Rita re-derived it. There are pages about shame. I'll tell you what those pages said, because I think they're the most important ones. Rita wrote that the hardest thing about surviving winter in a van, worse than any cold, was the feeling of being caught at it. The feeling of a stranger walking past the van at 7 a.m. and knowing someone had slept in there. She wrote that shame costs heat. I don't think she meant that metaphorically. I think she meant that literally. When you are ashamed, your body tenses. Tension burns energy. Energy is heat. Heat you spend on being ashamed is heat you don't have for staying alive. She wrote that the women who survived the longest, in her observation, were the ones who figured out how to stop being ashamed. Not because shame wasn't real, and not because their situation wasn't real, but because the shame was a second problem on top of the first problem, and you couldn't afford both. She wrote, "You pick one. You can be warm or you can be ashamed. You can't always be both." She picked warm. There was a winter Rita almost lost the van. It was the second one, 2012, in December. Spokane passed an ordinance that year about overnight parking in commercial lots. Somebody at the church had complained, though Rita never found out who. A patrol car came by at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, and the officer tapped on the window with his flashlight. Rita had been asleep for about 3 hours. The inside of the van was just warm enough. She told Cheryl later that the thing she remembers most about that night is not the officer. It was the cold air that came in when she opened the window to talk to him. How fast it undid everything. How a conversation of 4 minutes with the window cracked maybe 5 inches dropped the inside temperature so far that she couldn't get back to sleep for 2 hours, and she was shaking the whole time. The officer was kind. That's what she said. He told her she couldn't stay there, but he also told her about an overnight lot the city had started letting people use on a gravel plot off Havana Street, where the police wouldn't bother you if you were parked by 10 and gone by 7. She moved the van the next day. The thing she wrote about that night, in the notebook, was not about the ordinance or the officer. It was about how expensive a conversation can be in the cold when warmth is something you've built carefully and have nowhere to rebuild. She wrote, "Every open door costs, every open window, every time you have to explain yourself to someone. If you're doing this, understand that your warmth is made of small things, and talking is one of the small things that can break them." She wrote that women especially get asked to explain themselves more often than men do. By officers, by passers-by, by church staff who want to make sure you're not loitering, by other homeless people who want to know your situation. Every one of those conversations happens through a cracked window. Every cracked window is a tax on your night. She started refusing, politely but firmly, to roll the window down for anyone after 9 p.m. She'd talk through the glass, voice raised. She'd show her ID through the glass if she had to. She wouldn't open. Cheryl said Rita taught her that. Cheryl now tells the women who come into the drop-in center, "You don't owe anyone a conversation that costs you your sleep." There's something Rita watched in those 4 winters that took her longer than anything else to understand. She watched other women who were doing worse than she was. Not just worse in the sense of being sicker or older or having less money, though some of them were those things. Worse in the specific sense of being less warm at night, when by all accounts they should have been warmer. There was a woman named Alice who stayed in an old Buick about 2 blocks from Rita's parking spot for most of the winter of 2013. Alice had more gear than Rita. She had a real sleeping bag, a 20 below zero bag that someone had donated to her. She had a proper foam camping pad. She had 2 heavy wool blankets. By every reasonable measure, Alice should have been sleeping warmer than Rita. She wasn't. She was having bad nights. She was getting up in the middle of the night and walking around the block to warm up. Rita watched her do it. She watched Alice's car lights come on at 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning, as Alice got out to stamp her feet and try to restart her circulation. Rita couldn't figure it out for a long time. Then one afternoon, she and Alice were talking by a dumpster behind a 7-Eleven, and Alice mentioned that she'd been wearing her coat to bed, inside her sleeping bag, because it was her warmest piece of clothing, and she figured she'd stay warmest if she wore it. Rita almost fell over. This was, she later realized, one of the deepest and most common mistakes people make in the cold. The thing that had been taught to her by doing, over 1,000 nights, that almost nobody knows. You are the heat source, not the coat. The coat, on its own, has no heat. The coat works by trapping air your body has warmed. If you wear the coat tight to your body, the air between your body and the coat is small. The warmed air can't expand. The coat doesn't insulate as well as it should. If you wear the coat inside a sleeping bag, the bag's job is supposed to be trapping the warm air around your whole body. The coat, inside the bag, is doing the bag's job for a small part of your body and doing it worse. And it's compressing the loft of the bag around your arms and torso, so the bag's fill can't puff up and trap air the way it's designed to. The coat, inside the bag, cools you down. Not always, but often. Rita told Alice this. She told her to sleep in a wool base layer, a wool sweater, and long johns, to put the coat on top of the sleeping bag like a comforter, the way Rita did with her second bag. to let the sleeping bag do its work. Alice tried it. Alice slept through the night for the first time that winter. She came over the next morning and cried in the passenger seat of Rita's van for about 10 minutes. "This is," Rita wrote, "the thing that almost nobody understands about staying warm. Your body is the furnace. The clothes and the bags and the walls are just the chimney. You don't dress to be warm. You dress to let your body's warmth collect around you without escaping. There's a difference, and the difference is the whole game." She wrote, "Wearing your coat to bed is like lighting a fire in the chimney instead of the fireplace." I read that line about 4 times. Rita watched another woman, a younger one named Jasmine, who slept in a tent in a wooded area by the Spokane River for about 6 weeks in early 2014. Jasmine was 29. She'd had a kid taken away by Child Protective Services. She was trying to get clean. She was doing about as badly as it's possible to do and still be alive. Rita brought her food twice a week. They got to know each other. Jasmine's problem, Rita figured out, was that she was sweating at night. Jasmine was wearing too much. She was getting into her sleeping bag with 3 layers of clothing, zipping up, and in the first 2 hours of sleep her body would heat the inside of the bag aggressively because she had too much insulation on, and she would start to sweat. The sweat soaked her base layer. The base layer turned from dry to damp. Damp clothes conduct heat 25 times faster than dry ones. Around 3 in the morning, her body would cool below the point where the damp clothes were helping. She'd wake up shivering in a wet shirt inside a sleeping bag in a tent in February. Rita explained this to her. She told her to start with less, not more, to put on a wool base layer, a wool mid-layer, and get in the bag. If you get cold in the first hour, add a layer from the bag you've got next to you. Don't start hot. Never start hot. You can't get dry again until morning. She wrote in the notebook, "The sleeping bag is for sleeping. You're not supposed to be hot in it. You're supposed to be exactly warm enough. Hot means you're losing water." Jasmine didn't make it through that winter. She died in early March of an overdose, not of cold. Rita found out from Cheryl a week later and sat in the van for most of an afternoon without doing anything. She wrote, "I wish I'd told her about the sweat sooner." There's a thing about women and warmth that Rita said to Dolores once, late in the 3rd winter, that Dolores wrote down on an index card and kept. She said, "Men think warmth is about strength. Women know it's about attention," she said. "You don't beat the cold. You notice it, and you move around it." She said, "The woman who notices her feet are a little cold at 10 p.m. and puts on another pair of socks is a woman who sleeps through the night. The woman who tells herself she's fine because she doesn't want to get out of the bag is the woman who wakes up shaking at 2. She said, "Attention is the whole thing. If you pay attention, you'll survive. If you don't, all the gear in the world won't save you." Dolores put the index card in a drawer. It's still there. I want to close with something that happened at the drop-in center about 3 years after Rita moved into the apartment. A woman came in. She was maybe 35. She'd been sleeping in the back of a pickup truck for about 2 weeks. She was shaking when she came in, not from cold, from something else. Fear, Cheryl thought. Cheryl sat her down, got her some coffee, asked her what she needed. The woman said she needed to know how to not die. Cheryl went and got a copy of Rita's notebook pages. She sat down next to the woman and opened the notebook and said, "A woman named Rita, who lived in a van for 4 winters, figured this out. Read it. Ask me questions. Take it with you." The woman started reading. She got about 2 pages in and started crying. Cheryl asked her what was wrong. The woman said, "Nobody ever taught me any of this." Cheryl said, "Nobody teaches any of us this anymore. We all forgot." The woman said, "Who's Rita?" Cheryl said, "She was a home health aide who slept in a Ford Aerostar behind a church for 4 winters in a row and didn't die," and wrote down why. The woman said, "Why didn't anyone make this into a book?" Cheryl said, "I don't know. I don't know either. There are 100 books about backcountry winter camping, written by men with gear companies and sponsorships and weeks of wilderness training. They are detailed and correct, and they will keep you alive. They are not for a 58-year-old home health aide with a bad disc and $240. They're not for a 35-year-old woman in the back of a pickup truck in a parking lot in October. Rita's notebook was. Rita's notebook came out of a specific kind of knowing that we used to think of as women's knowing, and that we stopped valuing about the time central heating became standard, and that we will need again if anything in the world we've built ever stops working. You don't have to be homeless to want to know this. You don't have to wait for a blackout, or a storm, or a breakdown. You can learn it the way Rita learned it, which was by paying attention to what's cold and what's warm in your own home and moving things around. Or you can learn it the way women learned it for 10,000 years before Rita, which was from other women, handed down. Or you can learn it from Rita, who handed it down sideways, through Cheryl, through a spiral notebook in a drawer, in a drop-in center in Spokane. This is Rita handing it to you. Cardboard between you and the ground. Wool, because wool works wet. Hot water at your feet before sleep. Vapor out. Moisture managed. Mouth out of the bag. The belly in the feet. And the thing about shame, there's a reason we used to know this. There's a reason we forgot. There's a reason some women, in some parking lots, still remember.